people watch them afterwards. So pretty good response rate for the videos. So given that, we are going to do that again this go round. We are going to talk about a fair bit of topical areas today. We're starting off with an overview of chapters 4 and 5 of the watershed plan. So if you didn't get copies, the chapters 4 and 5 are back there on the table. They're a surefire cure for insomnia. If you suffer from that, that'll put you right to sleep in record time. No drugs required. There's also copies of the presentations back there and a sign-in sheet. So please do sign in for us before you leave today if you haven't already. So within that chapter 4 and 5 overview, we'll talk about the pollutant sources, like the title says, and some of the assessment methods that were used to evaluate the influences of those various sources. From there, we'll switch to discussions regarding management measures and basically the ins and outs of those items as well. Transition into education and outreach needs, along with technical and financial assistance, and then wrap up the day with monitoring and measures of success that can be included in the plan. So this is all draft content, so we definitely want input, thoughts, ideas, suggestions, questions, all that good stuff along the way. So our kind of approach is that if you don't ask questions, we assume that you love everything and we're going to press on. Otherwise, do stop us along the way and ask those questions. So to start us off, Mr. Ennis Rios is going to talk about watershed pollutant sources and assessment activity. He's the guy behind the scenes that did most of the work. So we're going to let him do most of the talking too. So, but yeah, take it away, Ennis.
All right. Thank you, Lucas. As Lucas said, my name is Ennis Rios. I work with he and Claire at Texas Water Resource Institute. I'm going to take you through the watershed pollutant sources, potential sources of pollution in the watershed. How many people were able to attend the last meeting? Okay, a good amount of there. Okay, good amount of people. So I'm not going to spend too much time on some of the first few slides because it's a little bit of review from the last time. But by all means, if you have any questions or something stands out at you, we welcome the feedback. If you see anything that might need to be adjusted or you have something to add. With that, I should just for the general edification of everybody in the room, there are two kinds of pollutant sources that we take a look at in building these protection plans. We've got point source pollution and non-point source pollution. It's kind of as it sounds, but point source are things like the wastewater treatment plants that might have a pipe that drains into the creek. You can obviously point at it and say that is the source of the pollution that we're seeing. Non-point really covers almost everything else. Anything that gets deposited on the land, on the soil, wastewater, stream water, or urban runoff that flows eventually through storm events or just getting carried somehow through wind or whatever into the creeks that we're looking at. So these are a few examples of things that we see in the watershed that are point and non-point sources. And more in depth to that. The first thing, kind of the easiest thing to cover is the point source pollution, because again, there is a point of potential pollution, I should say. These are not necessarily sources of pollution, so long as everything's functioning properly. But the wastewater treatment facilities, within the two watersheds combined, we see about 15 of those. 15 that are actively licensed, I should say, and all of them have varying discharges that are allowed. So the potential is kind of based on their maximum discharge, if that makes sense. And a little more in depth to that is sanitary sewer overflows. These are self-reported. So if any of those facilities have any kind of overflow event or known leak event, or kind of as it sounds, overflow event, they can voluntarily report that. So I mean, the information is kind of as good as is reported, and this covers 2 years of reporting from 2016 to 2018. The creeks that are being emptied into or that the waste is being drained into are over here on the left side. And then these are the events and kind of the average discharge estimated for each of those events. So obviously this is kind of like a point source of pollution that occurs within the watershed and that we look to address within the plan.
What are the disincentives to reporting? You said they self-report, so what happens?
Well, there is no real incentive to self-report. I don't know. Are there any disincentives that we've heard of?
Well, I mean, they're required to report these events, but they don't necessarily know of all the events either. I mean, a lot of these things occur like in a manhole out in the distribution system somewhere along the way. So the vast majority of them go unreported because there's no specific knowledge of it.
I mean, if you were in a larger city that had this, like maybe the technology and stuff to even what they call it, SCADA or some of those systems that would help. Some of these rural systems don't have that technology, so it's just gonna it might go unnoticed or whatever.
I mean, the disincentive to reporting, though, is that if you have a lot of these SSO events, state could say, hey, something's wrong. Y'all need to get your stuff together and slap you on the wrist for finding and things like that. They do have programs to help address these sanitary sewer overflow issues. They have a sanitary sewer initiative or an SSO initiative where basically the state will allow you to make corrective action within your system rather than pay fines back to the state if they so desire you to do so.
So with numbers like this, just from your experience working in other watersheds, how representative are those numbers of the real total?
That's a great unknown. I mean, think about an event like Hurricane Harvey, which granted that's an extreme. Everything was an SSO at that point. So, I mean, I know in Houston they had wastewater treatment plants themselves that were 10, 12 feet underwater. So obviously they're not functioning properly. So I would say that this is probably a literal drop in the bucket as far as what actually occurs out there, but that's just pure speculation. And with age, the systems become more and more problematic because ground shifts, pipes break, roots enter in there, blockages occur. And with all the flushable things that are out there nowadays, they create havoc within the system and create blockages. You might technically be able to flush it down a toilet, but you shouldn't in a lot of cases. So there's that commercial where they dump all the golf balls in there and flush it. I'm like, that's a terrible idea. Giving people ideas.
I think with the initiative though, don't they, there's some stuff built in for self-reporting where they kind of guide you through the process.
I'm not 100% sure on that.
I haven't looked at it in a couple of years, but I think there's some guidance in there for the plants and stuff, so they're not getting, because some of them just are at a point where they're just so run down that you know.
They have more failures than good.
Yeah. We worked. I worked in animal act. We did on that. Every time it rained a half inch, it was so people just because there's so much iron. Yeah. So it just, I think there's some things built into those, but I think each of these systems, the nature of the whole nature of them, so you might have a lot of unreported stuff.
And a lot of that the sanitary sewer overflows occurs in the collection system, not at the plant proper. So this is out in town and things like that. So like I know in most stores in the process of taking over operation and maintenance and management of a lot of the smaller plants down here. And that's a great thing. I think it's probably one of the better options out there as far as dealing with these issues are concerned. But that distribution system is still out there. And Sam, I don't know, you may have some details on those arrangements relative to the distribution or the collection systems, but is y'all's takeover and management of those systems include that, or are y'all focused on the plants specifically?
Yeah, the plants specifically, I think that they've visited a bunch of them and tried to identify needs. Now I think the next phase is we're trying to get pots of money in some of those. We did have I think Danketty wastewater plant, and then the Driscoll plant, we did identify some funding. I think it was $50,000 or something fairly recently to get some equipment and stuff upgrades. That was, I think we would make it to the county. Counties asked for some money, and they were very receptive because we before a lot of these wastewater plants are they weren't real sure about if you give them $50,000, what's your money going to be going toward? And so that I think they have some pretty good reception with us backing a lot of those now. Is our director, John Byram, he worked in wastewater before he was the river authority. So we're trying to build our reputation up for wastewater. And so they said, as long as now that you're in charge of that, if y'all are asking for the money, we're going to give it to you. So we're hoping to repeat that in different places. Yeah, upgrading right now, identifying and upgrading is basically what we're doing. Hope that answers it.
And to add to that, I met with Travis yesterday about this actually. So it's both the treatment and the collection infrastructure that they're seeking some funds right now to address. So, excellent. So,
Won't be a snap of the fingers to fix it, obviously, but step in the right direction.
Well, having to do with SSOs, somewhat related, is on-site sewage facilities. So whether it's, leach field or whatever kind of OSSF they have on site, it is a potential source of non-point source pollution through either, lack of maintenance or a catastrophic failure of something, and then you've got a overland flow carrying it into the creeks. So within the watershed, we've identified an estimated 9,086, and 25 of those are within 100 yards of a water body. We know that down in this area, there's something like a 4 to 12%, depending which county it is that you take the number from, failure rate of OSSFs. So, we can assume that there are some out there that are not functioning completely properly that could be addressed. I think we've talked about looking for sources of funding to maybe repair those, and how much funding can you get, and how many years can we make the repairs. So this information is going to be included in the plan as well. Another non-point source that kind of dominates the area down here outside of the urban areas is livestock. These are the estimated numbers of livestock that we kind of went over at the last meeting. For any of you that are new to this meeting, if you take a look at these numbers and you have any insight on them, you think they're too high or too low, we welcome the feedback. They're just estimates, because ultimately what we want to do with these numbers are estimate the total potential bacteria load that could be created from these sources, and where those potential bacteria loads are, so that we can kind of focus our efforts in those areas. And we'll get to some maps that kind of diagram that later really well. Wild animals, we tried to quantify down here, but as you know, these are estimations because it's kind of hard to count deer and hog. But these were estimations from Texas Park and Wildlife. They go out and do surveys every once in a while on little tracts of land and try to apply that number, more broadly. We kind of took feedback from y'all at last meeting and through some email communications to kind of adjust the numbers higher or lower depending on the area that we're looking at. These are the only wild animals that we have estimates for. Someone at the last meeting asked if we could try to quantify birds in the area, migratory birds, to see what kind of potential bacteria loading they provide, but that information is hard to come by because they're migratory. Pets, American Vet Medical Association provides like an average pets per household of dogs and cats. And these are numbers that we estimated in the area. We don't expect a lot of bacteria load compared to some of the other producers in this area, but it's still relevant. And one of the things that we've talked about addressing in the plan are maybe like pet waste stations. Would that help in some of the urban areas, some of the parks to lessen this load? If you look at all the potential sources as 100%, pets might be a small amount on there, but if we can chip away at it, it's something. It adds to decreasing the overall bacteria load that's in the creek and ultimately down in the bay. Illegal dumping. I feel like we've talked about this a lot in the last meeting. I think it's very relevant in this area. Lucas and I stopped on the way down here. We saw a spot that we were just going to take pictures of the landscape to include in some of the reports or presentations. And I mean, we picked a random spot along the road at the USGS gauge. I took the drone up, went out like 200 yards off the bridge, and I mean, just tires and trash and everything. So these pictures, you know, taken from, was it Nueces River Authority took these on the right? I mean, it's obviously a problem down here. So addressing this is something that's going to be important in the watershed protection plan.
We gotta, we put that picture, that last slide on the left. I don't know if that's one we took or not. I think it is. But we, TxDOT reached out to us and said they saw that, and you know, an old college buddy of mine, and they're gonna clean all that up. They're big right now, and they're gonna hire a contractor, and they're gonna clean that. That's FM 70 on Petronila Creek.
Huh.
There's gonna be a little good news story. Once that's done, we're gonna do some before. You have some before pictures, and do some after. Kind of show that off. not too distant future. Maybe, hopefully by next month.
Yeah. Nutrients. You know, nutrients in this area are obviously a concern. We talked about there are no nutrient standards in Texas, but there are screening levels. And, you know, I'll show you some data plots later that kind of show that even where nutrients are concerned, we're over the levels, just like with E. coli or Entero. So it is a concern in this area to address all the potential sources here, which we kind of covered in some of the previous slides. And this is where we get into kind of breaking down the numbers and quantifying, like, look, we're saying nutrients and bacteria is a problem, but no, really it is a problem because measurements have been taken and quantified, and these are the results. This is just one way to look at the amount of data. So bacteria, each of these represent like assessment units on the creeks. And each of these numbers down here are the stations where the measurements were taken. And you can see that bacteria, Entero and E. coli, 50% of the data is generally above where the allowable level is at in most of the situations, all but one really. So it is actually a problem beyond just lip service of saying like bacteria is bad. We need to address it. It really is. Chlorophyll A, it's one of the nutrients that we test for. Chlorophyll A, total phosphorus, nitrate, and ammonia. As it says on the bottom there, ammonia, nitrate, total phosphorus, usually we're below the screening level. Again, not a standard, but like a screening level. But chlorophyll A, these are the levels that we got from testing. Not us personally, but a collection of data going back, I think back to 1991-ish or 2001, depending. So it goes pretty far back, and in every situation here, chlorophyll A is higher, and obviously nutrients being in the water kind of creates a lot of a cycle of problems. So it is something that we want to address in the plan, even if it seems like the plan is more heavily loaded towards bacteria and stuff. It is because that's kind of where the funding is, but a lot of the things that we do to address those hopefully have kind of a trickle down effect into improving the chlorophyll or nutrient levels, chlorophyll and all the others. This is the bacteria loading. What these two plots are really good at showing us is that there is not really a focus area between point and non-point source pollution. So if the left side of each one of these is high flow, medium flow, and then low flow, you can kind of see where the average is, the bacteria loading. So, you know, if you saw spikes in here of the bacteria loading, you might be inclined to think that there was something, some kind of massive discharge from a point source, you know, wastewater treatment plant or something, like drove a spike up, but the rest of the time the points are really low. but that's not the case. We kind of have points evenly distributed there across the middle, whether it's high flow or low flow. So that means that basically anytime there's a high flow event, medium flow event, or barely any flow, we're still getting bacteria indications in the waterways. So it's not really a point source or a non-point source. It's both together. So I mean, it basically tells us that we need to address both aspects, as opposed to if we were looking at something that was specific to like a leaking facility or something like that, you might just look for a spike and say, yeah, well, they recorded a spike this year, or recorded a huge leak event this year. That's indicated here. Clearly, we need to go look at that treatment facility or something, but that's not the case here. So addressing everything. Okay, so the next couple slides are called the select model, basically. And what we did was basically put information in there, and it pulls information automatically from a few sources and tries to basically come up with where do the focus of our efforts need to be, looking at several different factors. Animals, what types of animals, the population, treatment facilities, OSSFs. It tries to say, like, if the maximum bacteria loading from each of these sources is this amount, where do we need to focus our efforts? So for white-tailed deer, you know, being one of the examples we'll present, you know, the red areas are the areas where there's probably the highest density of deer, which means there's probably the highest potential for deer to provide bacteria loading into that watershed, or all these subbasins. So that's where you would want to address the concern there. And then pets is kind of, it makes sense. It's around the urban areas, or most heavily around the urban area. Feral hogs, this number, instead of taking what the select model just kind of provides, we took feedback from y'all and kind of made some adjustments based on the land use, land cover, and what people actually kind of observed on their property or properties they know of. So that was where we see the highest concentration or the highest potential for E. coli from feral hog contributions. And then livestock. And then all these, while they're all cool just to look at individually, I mean, really what we want to find out are the total potential E. coli loading in the watershed. So you take all these and kind of merge them together, OSSFs, wastewater treatment facilities, and you end up with this total potential load. So if you had no other information and you just kind of collected all the data about livestock population, pets, wildlife, and treatment facilities, and you kind of conglomerated all that together, then this, where it's red and then orange and then yellow and then the shades of green, it kind of gives you a starting point to say, like, well, this is probably where we need to focus our efforts the most. Maybe not all your efforts, but different efforts, because it's different, obviously, for the urban areas and the rural areas, what kind of management measures you include there. So this is kind of a good starting point. So with that, if anybody has any questions or feedback on any of these slides or any of the information, send them our way.
I got a question for Sam. So when we've sampled Petronila this summer, once you get above 77, it seemed like there was very little water there. I don't know if that's what you see. You got some water there? It seems like most of the water flow is south of